Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me introduce myself. My name is Maria Clara Virginia Assi. I'm from Makassar State University, Faculty of Language and Literature, Department of English Education. Okay, here I want to explain about nonverbal communication competence. Okay, especially how to use nonverbal messages effectively in decoding and encoding meaning. Throughout the discussion of nonverbal communication, you've probably deduced a number of suggestions for improving your nonverbal communication. Here, we bring together some suggestions for both receiving or decoding and sending or encoding nonverbal messages. Perhaps the most general skills that applies to both receiving and sending is to become mindful of nonverbal messages, those of others as well as your own. Observe those whose nonverbal behavior you find particularly effective and those you find ineffective. Try to identify exactly what makes one effective and one ineffective. Consider this discussion to brief introduction to a lifelong study. Okay, so we are going to talk about this decoding nonverbal messages. Decoding is the process of receiving the information and how the individual processes that information based on their previous experiences. When you make judgments or draw conclusions about another person on the basis of her or his nonverbal messages, consider the several suggestions. Okay, so first, when making judgment, mindfully seek alternative judgment. Consider the vast array of choices for, say, interpreting or describing a person's behavior. Your first judgment choice may be in error. Um, and one good way to test it is to consider alternative judgment. When your romantic partner creates a greater than normal distance between you, it may signal an annoyance with you, but it can also signal that your partner needs some space to think something out. Another example is when your neighbors are not participating in the mebarung in my culture, it may signal dislike with you, but it can also signal that your neighbor maybe need a rest. Maybe they are not in good health. Okay, so next, be tentative. Resist the temptation to draw conclusion from nonverbal behaviors. Instead, develop hypotheses or like educated guesses about what is going on and test the validity of your hypothesis on the basis of other evidence. Next is notice that messages come from lots of different channels and that reasonably accurate judgment can be made only when multiple channels are taken into consideration. Although textbooks must present the areas of nonverbal communication separately, the various elements all work together in actual communication situation. And the fourth is even after you explore the different channels, consider the possibility that you are incorrect. This is especially true when you make a judgment that another person is lying based on that person's say eye avoidance or long pauses. These nonverbal signals may mean lots of things, as well as the possibility of lying. But another possibility is the person is maybe embarrassed if they have to make eye contact, so maybe they avoid the eye contact and long pauses. So, but in my hometown in Toraja, it's called Masiri Siri. And next, the fifth is interpret your judgment and conclusions against a cultural context. Consider, for example, if you interpret another's nonverbal behavior through its meaning in your own culture, for example, if you interpret someone's overly close talking distance as intrusive or pushy because that's your culture interpretation, you may miss the possibility that this distance is simply standard in the other person's culture, or it's a way of signaling closeness and friendliness. Especially in my own culture, talking at close range indicates someone wants to talk about something important, and we can say that maybe they want to say something secret so that other people can't hear it. And next, consider the multitude of factors that can influence the way a person behaves nonverbally. For example, a person's physical condition, personality, or particular situation may all influence a person's nonverbal communication. A sore stomach may be more of influential and unpleasant expression than any interpersonal factor. A low grade in an exam may make your normally pleasant roommates cold and grumble. Without knowing these factors, it's difficult to make an accurate judgment. Or another example is in my village, my culture, if people propose at night or parampo makaren, people usually assume that they will have a less lively wedding party. In fact, it is possible that the bride and groom didn't carry out the proposal ceremony during the day because they were constrained by their very busy work schedules. Okay, next we are moving to encoding nonverbal messages. Encoding is the act of producing communication using gestures, facial expression, and posture. In using nonverbal messages, whether unconsciously or to express your meanings, consider these suggestions. The first is consider your choices for your nonverbal communication just as you do uh, for your verbal messages. Identify and think mindfully about the choices you have available for communicating what you want to communicate. And the second is keep your nonverbal messages consistent with your verbal messages. Avoid sending verbal messages that say one thing and nonverbal messages that say something else, at least when you want to be believed. For example, in my culture, we are not allowed to mepakaran ranuan. This is means that we shouldn't make people feel loved if we do not love them. So we must harmonize our verbal and nonverbal communication. If we do not really love someone, we should act like we love. We shouldn't. We shouldn't act like we love them, even padahal kita tidak mencintai mereka. And next, monitor your on nonverbal messages with the same care that you monitor your verbal messages. If it's not appropriate to say this meal is terrible, then it's not appropriate to have a negative expression when you're asked if you want seconds. Next, avoid extremes and monotony. Too little nonverbal communication or too much are likely to be responded to negatively. Negatively. Similarly, always giving the same nonverbal messages. Say continually smiling and nodding your head when listening to a friend's long story is likely to be seen as incensory. Just like in my culture, if an older person speaks and we just nod, it will be considered impolite. Next, uh, take the situation into consideration. Effective nonverbal communication is situational. To be effective, adapt your nonverbal messages to the specific situation. Next is maintain eye contact with the speaker. Whether at meeting, in the hallway, or on elevator, it can communicate politeness and say that you're giving the person consideration of your full attention. Just like in my culture, when talking to people, we have to look them in the eyes. It's not good if you don't face the person you're talking to. Next, avoid using certain adapters in public. For example, like combing your hair, picking your teeth, or putting your pinky in your ear, because this will be seen as impolite. Especially in my culture, it's considered rude if someone blow their nose loudly while talking to someone else. Next, avoid strong cologne or perfume. While you may enjoy the scent, those around you may find it unpleasant and intrusive. Much like others do not want to hear your soul messages, they probably don't want to have their sense of smell invaded either. And the last is be careful with touching. It may or may not be considered appropriate or polite depending on the relationship you have with the other person and on the context in which you find yourself. The best advice to give here is to avoid touching unless it's part of the culture or uh, that group or organization. Okay, I think we are on the last part. So the conclusion is on decoding, you can increase your nonverbal decoding competence by mindfully seeking alternative judgment, being tentative, attending to all nonverbal channels, considering being wrong, being sensitive to cultural context, and considering vast array of factors that can influence what persons does or say. And for encoding, you can increase your nonverbal encoding competence by considering your choices for communicating, being consistent in your messages, monitoring your nonverbal choices, avoiding extremes, being aware of the situation, maintaining eye contact, avoid adapters, avoiding strong and potentially unpleasant scents, and being cautious about touching. Okay, so that's all from me. I'm sorry if there is anything wrong about my explanation. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.